Flight attendant disrespects the wrong woman. Minutes later, a 3.2B crisis hits the airline. In a world where power usually announces itself with logos and luxury brands, sometimes true influence wears a weathered coat and speaks in whispers. When flight attendant Chloe dismissed elderly passenger Barbara Langford from first class based solely on appearances, she had no idea she was confronting the woman who controlled 40% of her airline's fleet. No shouting match followed. No manager was summoned. Instead, Barbara made one quiet phone call from 35,000 feet that would freeze stock trading, trigger a corporate crisis, and cost the airline $3.2 billion in market value before the wheels even touched the ground. What followed wasn't just comeuppance, it was a masterclass in dignity that would transform an entire industry. Have you ever wondered about the true cost of disrespect? If this story of quiet power and accountability resonates with you, hit the like button right now. Share your thoughts in the comments, and keep watching to see how one woman's dignity changed an entire industry. This is a story you won't want to miss. Barbara appeared. Chloe was tall, blonde, perfect, and walked like she'd just stepped off a runway. Her uniform fit like it had been tailored just for her. She glanced Barbara up and down coat, shoes, soft curls of graying hair, and immediately tightened her smile into something thin and plastic. "Ma'am, economy is boarding through the rear." Barbara blinked. "I'm in 3A. Chloe hesitated, visibly scanning the woman again, as if her eyes might override the printed words. Barbara, still calm, took the boarding pass from her coat and handed it over. Chloe grabbed it a little too fast, barely hiding her disbelief. She stared at the pass longer than she needed to, checking, double-checking, and finally stepped aside. "I see," she said curtly. "Right this way." Barbara didn't flinch. She nodded once and moved toward her seat. Third row, window, left side. As she passed a man in a crisp navy suit, he looked up from his phone just long enough to raise one eyebrow. A young woman buckling a baby into a seat gave Barbara a faint smile, then quickly looked away. Have you ever been in a situation where someone immediately decided who you were based on how you looked? How did that moment make you feel? Barbara slid into her seat and placed her handbag under the one in front of her. She moved slowly but deliberately, like someone used to making her own space without causing disruption. She adjusted her coat, folded her hands, and stared out the window. Behind her, she could hear Chloe muttering to the other flight attendant. "Some people will wear anything to get into first class these days." Barbara didn't react. She just watched the tarmac where the fuel truck rumbled by and ground crew loaded the last of the luggage. The same thing had happened before, just in different places with different uniforms. She had stopped keeping track of how often people underestimated her. The weight of it didn't sting anymore. Not the way it once did, but that didn't mean she didn't notice. As the cabin began to fill, a couple across the aisle whispered to each other while looking in her direction. Barbara leaned back slightly and closed her eyes. She wasn't tired. She just didn't want to give anyone else her gaze. Some things didn't deserve your attention. From the front, Chloe called out boarding groups, her voice crisp and commanding. When she walked past Barbara again, her eyes flicked toward her like a challenge. Barbara kept hers closed. She didn't owe the woman a response. She wasn't here to prove she belonged. She had already proven enough in her life. And if anyone in this cabin or on this airline truly knew who she was, they wouldn't be whispering or second-guessing or muttering about coats and shoes. They'd be sitting up straighter. They'd be regretting every word. But Barbara Langford didn't need to remind anyone of her worth. Not with words. She'd let the right phone call do that. Barbara had just settled into seat 3A when the cabin filled with the scent of citrus-scented sanitizer and stale coffee. She adjusted the small pillow behind her back and placed her paperback in the seat pocket in front of her. For a moment, she let herself enjoy the hum of the aircraft, the muted buzz that always felt oddly comforting. But the moment didn't last long. She heard the deliberate click of heels approaching. "Excuse me, ma'am." Barbara opened her eyes. The same flight attendant, Chloe, was now standing directly beside her, arms crossed over her navy blue uniform, iPad in hand. "I'll need to verify your boarding pass again." Barbara's expression didn't change. "I already showed it at the gate." "Is there a problem?" Chloe pressed her lips together, giving a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just a standard double check. Nothing personal." Barbara could feel the eyes of nearby passengers beginning to land on her. Subtle glances, sideways looks. One man openly leaning forward with curiosity. The feeling was familiar. She'd felt it in boardrooms, in bank lobbies, even at country clubs, the weight of being questioned in rooms where people assumed she didn't belong. Without a word, she reached into her coat and pulled out the same pass. Chloe snatched it quickly, as though the faster she moved, the less anyone might notice the awkwardness. "You're in 3A, she asked flatly, like the answer might suddenly change. Barbara simply nodded. Chloe looked at the digital manifest on her iPad again, even though the seating chart was perfectly clear. After a beat, she handed the pass back, but not gently. Her palm smacked Barbara's fingers hard enough that the paper slipped and fluttered to the floor. A small gasp came from across the aisle. Barbara bent slowly to pick it up, her movements graceful despite the awkward angle. She straightened back into her seat, smoothed the boarding pass between her palms, and turned to Chloe with a calm, level gaze. "You should be more careful," she said softly. "Not with me. With everyone." For the first time, Chloe's confidence faltered. There was something unsettling about how still Barbara remained, how she didn't raise her voice, how she didn't plead or fume. Her silence was heavier than most people shouting. "I'm just doing my job," Chloe muttered, suddenly sounding much younger. Barbara returned the boarding pass to her pocket and turned back to the window. "That may be true," she replied, "but that doesn't make it right." The other flight attendant, Monica, according to her name tag, had been watching from the galley. She gave Chloe a pointed look but said nothing. Barbara caught the glance and offered Monica the faintest of nods, one that communicated something without needing a word. "I see you too." Have you ever witnessed someone maintain their dignity in the face of disrespect? What power did their restraint have that anger never could? The first-class cabin grew quiet after that. Chloe stalked away to the front galley, clicking her heels like a metronome of frustration. Passengers returned to their devices, but the air had changed. Something about that moment had shifted the tone of the flight. Barbara looked out the window again, her reflection barely visible in the thick double-pane glass. A younger version of herself might have said something sharper, might have demanded to see a supervisor or asked for the pilot, but she had learned over time that power didn't come from making noise. It came from knowing when you didn't have to. Across the aisle, a young man in his 20s looked over at her. "That was messed up," he said under his breath. "You handled it better than I would have." Barbara smiled faintly. "Years of practice," she replied. The man chuckled awkwardly, unsure what to say next. Then he turned back to his tablet, tapping nervously. Barbara leaned her head against the side wall, closing her eyes again. Not to sleep, but to protect her peace. If there was one thing she had mastered in 68 years, it was when to let the world spin around her without getting pulled into its chaos. But peace wasn't something this flight was offering easily. 15 minutes later, Chloe was back. "Would you care for a drink before takeoff?" she asked, voice mechanical. Barbara opened her eyes slowly, met her gaze, and said, "No, thank you." There was no edge to her tone, but the way she said it made Chloe flinch slightly, as if even Barbara's refusal carried weight. Barbara didn't smile. She didn't soften it. She simply returned to looking out the window. By now, most of the passengers were seated. Overhead bins were shut, bags tucked under seats. A child's voice echoed from coach. The final boarding chime rang out, followed by the captain's voice over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 51182, non-stop service to Chicago O'Hare. Flight time will be 2 hours and 18 minutes. Barbara listened, but didn't really hear the rest. She was already thinking of the call she might have to make. She had hoped this wouldn't be one of those flights, but the ache in her chest told her it was. And if it was, she knew exactly what to do. The plane had leveled off at 35,000 feet. Soft chimes rang overhead as the seatbelt sign blinked off. Passengers shifted, unbuckled, reached for laptops and drinks. Conversations buzzed gently through the cabin business chatter, vacation plans, the occasional laugh from economy. But in seat 3A, Barbara Langford sat completely still. She didn't open her book. She didn't ask for a beverage. She just stared out the window like the clouds had something to tell her. Across the aisle, a woman in a cashmere sweater leaned in close to her partner and whispered something. Barbara could feel their eyes darting back to her. The attention didn't surprise her. It never did. But it was the flavor of it that stung. Pity, suspicion, misjudgment. They thought she was poor, lost, someone who had wandered into the wrong part of the plane. They saw her coat and her age and assumed everything else. No one saw power in a trench coat with fraying sleeves. Chloe, the flight attendant, returned to the aisle like she was walking a runway. This time, she didn't even look at Barbara. She served drinks to the other passengers, warm towels for the couple in 3C and 3D, a sparkling water with lime for the hedge fund guy in 2A, a mimosa for the influencer in 1B. But Barbara, nothing. She wasn't invisible. She was being deliberately ignored. Barbara exhaled quietly. She wasn't surprised. What disappointed her was how lazy the cruelty had become. Chloe didn't even bother hiding it anymore. A small tap came from behind. Monica, the other flight attendant, leaned gently over her seat back. Her eyes were kind. "Would you like anything, ma'am?" she asked quietly. Barbara offered her a soft nod. "Just a black coffee if it's not too much trouble." "Of course not." Chloe, watching from 2 rows up, snapped her head toward Monica. Their eyes locked for a second too long. Chloe's jaw tightened. Monica just raised her eyebrows, turned away, and went to fetch the coffee. Barbara noticed the exchange. She didn't miss the tension. Kindness, when it broke the pecking order, always drew heat. But Barbara wasn't here to make enemies or allies. She was here for one reason: to get to Chicago quietly, alone. But clearly, the universe had other plans. A businessman 3 seats away glanced over. He gave her a thin, polite smile, the kind people give to diffuse tension they don't want to be part of. Barbara nodded back, but her stomach felt heavy. Not with fear, with sadness, because this flight, like so many moments in her life, had become a test of who still saw worth only in the polished, who believed belonging came with price tags, last names, or tailored suits. She hadn't failed that test, but others were failing it now, publicly, and without realizing it. When Monica returned with her coffee, Barbara accepted it with both hands, her fingers brushing the warm ceramic. It felt grounding. Monica hesitated. "If there's anything else, anything at all, you just let me know," she said, not loudly, but loud enough for someone else to hear. Barbara met her eyes. "Thank you, dear. That means more than you know." Monica gave a small smile, then slipped away again. Chloe watched the whole thing from the galley. Her posture turned rigid, her arms crossed. She muttered something under her breath, then disappeared behind the curtain. Barbara took a sip of her coffee and let the warmth settle in her chest. She could feel the moment building, not just inside her, but in the cabin, the stairs, the whispers, the way Chloe moved more aggressively, slamming a bin, rushing a man as he adjusted his laptop tray. This wasn't about a mistake anymore. This was a choice, and choices had consequences. Do you ever wonder about the quiet power some people carry, how their restraint can speak volumes more than others' outbursts? Barbara turned her head and looked out the window again. She watched the clouds roll past like slow waves. Somewhere below, fields and towns and highways slipped by, unaware of the storm brewing in this cabin. She reached into her coat and pulled out her phone. No one noticed. She didn't dial right away. She just stared at the screen for a moment. Then her fingers moved calmly, deliberately, one number at a time. She wasn't calling to shout. She wasn't calling to demand. She was activating gravity. Back in row 4, the young man who'd defended her earlier was watching. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered on her phone, on her posture, on the strange, unshakable calm Barbara carried like armor. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what she'd done in her life, but something in him told him to keep watching, because this flight was no longer cruising. It was heading toward a reckoning, and Barbara Langford was at the center of it. Barbara ended the call with a gentle tap, then slipped her phone back into the inner pocket of her trench coat. There was no expression on her face, no victorious grin or smug satisfaction, just the calm, practiced stillness of a woman who had made the right call and knew it would take effect exactly when it needed to. The clouds outside the window looked the same, but inside the cabin, everything had begun to shift. Across the aisle, the businessman who'd been half watching her still couldn't figure out what had just happened. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't raised her voice. But something about her posture now, the way she leaned back, hands calmly resting in her lap, felt like a signal. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was watching. Meanwhile, at 35,000 feet, in a restricted, staff-unlocked channel labeled Ops Immediate, a red banner had just gone up. 3 executives at Horizon Regional Air were pinged simultaneously. One of them, based in Chicago, spilled his coffee when he saw the subject line, Request Flight 5182, Crew Flag Priority A. He clicked. The file attached was brief. No summary, no comments, just a forwarded internal code, L386 Langford Contact Action Pending. His jaw tightened. Back on the plane, Chloe had no idea what kind of storm she had just stepped into. She stood in the galley fussing with the service cart, arms folded tight across her chest. She'd caught Monica giving coffee to the old woman again, and it rubbed her raw. Chloe hated feeling like someone was undermining her authority. It had been happening more and more lately, ever since that layover in San Diego, where a passenger had written a complaint. She'd felt like eyes were always on her. But this was different. Barbara wasn't the usual complainer. She hadn't said anything. She didn't even look mad. That's what unsettled her. She looked ready. "You good?" Monica asked gently, brushing past her to grab a new stack of napkins. "I'm fine," Chloe snapped. "Just tired of being second-guessed." Monica didn't reply. She'd been working long enough to know when someone wasn't tired, just exposed. Back in first class, Barbara took another sip of her now cooling coffee. She noticed the businessman 2 seats up typing something on his laptop, but glancing over every couple of sentences, he didn't realize. She noticed. Most people didn't. She wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. She wasn't trying to make a statement, but silence in the right hands could be deafening. From the cockpit, the captain's voice returned, calm and dry. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some light turbulence in the next 20 minutes. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts when the sign is illuminated." Barbara obeyed, sliding the seatbelt across her lap slowly. She didn't mind turbulence. Life had been turbulent long before the skies ever were. Below her, the world rolled by in silence. But above it, in corporate towers, in crisis rooms, in group chats labeled VIP protocol and unlisted shareholders, a very specific chain of events had been triggered. Because the name Langford didn't show up in passenger databases the way others did. It was never tied directly to loyalty accounts or gold-tier memberships. It was tied to things deeper, quieter. Barbara Langford didn't own an airline. She didn't have to. But 30 years ago, her late husband had founded one of the most powerful aircraft leasing firms in North America, Langford Atlantic Holdings. And while she hadn't taken over his public-facing role after he'd passed, she'd quietly built her own reputation on the board. She still held 23% voting control in multiple air travel joint ventures, including Horizon Regional Air, and the calls she'd made just now not to a lawyer, not to a PR team, not even to the airline CEO. She'd called Cynthia Reyes, the chairwoman of Langford Atlantic and her late husband's protege. Cynthia wasn't known for theatrics, but when Barbara Langford called and said, "There's a problem on Flight 5182, things moved. Back in the cabin, Chloe stepped out of the galley to make another pass through the aisle. As she walked past Barbara, she didn't speak, didn't even glance down, but something in her body language had changed. Her chin was lifted higher. Her steps were sharper, almost defensive. Barbara didn't flinch. She didn't bother looking at her. She was looking past her now because Barbara knew this flight wasn't about coffee or tickets anymore. It wasn't about bad manners or bruised pride. It was about the price people paid when they underestimated the quiet ones. And this time, they weren't going to learn it behind closed doors. They were going to learn it before the wheels even touched the ground. Have you noticed how the most secure people rarely need to announce their importance? They let their actions speak instead. At exactly 11:17 Eastern Time, the captain's phone lit up with a direct alert from headquarters. He blinked, confused. Not because alerts were rare, but because this one bypassed the standard chain. It was flagged red level, the highest priority with a code he hadn't seen in years. Langford aboard, monitor immediate. Captain Russell Holtz had flown for 27 years. He had seen weather diversions, VIPs, even a senator once. But this meant someone powerful was watching right now from the ground. He tapped twice, entered his clearance code, and the full directive opened. Do not announce. Do not alter course. Stand by for executive instructions. Maintain discretion. No crew disturbance. Passenger 3A is to be given full deference. Holtz whistled low under his breath. He glanced toward the co-pilot. Something wrong? She asked, adjusting a dial. Nope, he said, clearing his throat. Just tighten everything. Corporate wants a smooth ride. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The tone in his voice was enough. Back in the cabin, Chloe was trying to smile her way through service, but it was a paper-thin act. Her cheeks ached from holding it together. She could still feel that woman in 3A watching her. Or worse, not watching her. The way she'd been dismissed with just a glance had unsettled her more than any complaint ever could. It was the quiet ones you had to worry about. From behind the curtain, Monica emerged again, checking inventory with quick efficiency. Chloe was about to speak when the intercom buzzed. An internal chime only for crew. Monica leaned toward the phone, nodded, and stepped back into the galley. Moments later, her eyes flicked up. Chloe, what data were it? You're wanted at the front. Now, for what? Monica didn't answer. She just looked at her. Chloe wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the cockpit, heels clicking too fast against the floor. The businessman in row 2 noticed. So did the couple in 4C and 4D, exchanging glances behind their sunglasses. As she approached the cockpit door, Captain Holtz met her halfway. He stepped into the small alcove near the lavatory and gestured for her to follow. You know a passenger in 3A? He asked, voice low but steady. Chloe's mouth opened, then closed. Yes, I mean, sort of. There was an issue during boarding. What kind of issue? Chloe hesitated. Just a seating confusion. She didn't look like she belonged in first, but she had a valid ticket. I handled it. Captain Holtz looked at her like she had just said something incredibly dumb, but was too polite to say so. She didn't just have a ticket, he said, crossing his arms. She owns most of the seats on this plane. Chloe blinked. What? You're flying Barbara Langford, he said flatly. As in Langford Atlantic Holdings, as in one of the top private aviation investors in the eastern U.S. Chloe felt like the floor under her shoes had vanished. She gripped the side wall. She didn't. Why wouldn't she say anything? She doesn't have to, the captain replied. People like her don't yell. They don't ask to speak to managers. They make one call and let the rest unfold. Chloe felt her stomach twist into a knot. The captain's voice grew colder. Do you know how many planes Horizon leases from her company? She shook her head. Almost 40% of our regional fleet. If she pulled her contracts, we'd have planes sitting grounded in hangars next month. Silence fell between them. Captain Holtz sighed. I don't know what you said to her, but I do know we're being watched now. This flight is under observation, And the message from corporate is clear. Do not mess this up. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. That made it worse. Chloe nodded, barely holding it together. As she walked back down the aisle, she felt like she was moving through water. The passengers seemed quieter. The light above her flickered slightly. Every step sounded louder than it should have. And at row 3, she saw Barbara Langford again, still quiet, still watching. And this time, Chloe couldn't meet her eyes. In the galley, Monica glanced over as Chloe passed. "You good?" she asked again. "No," Chloe said quietly. "No, I think I made a very big mistake." The air inside the cabin had changed. Not the temperature, not the recycled chill of 35,000 feet, but something less tangible. Something people felt but couldn't name. It started with silence. Not the peaceful, sleepy kind you expect mid-flight. This was the sharp kind. The kind that makes people glance up from their books and pause their movies without knowing why. Even the baby in 7D had stopped fussing. The toddler across the aisle suddenly reached for her mother's hand. Something unspoken had swept through the cabin, and it made the whole space feel too still. Barbara Langford sat quietly in 3A, her coffee long since cooled. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, one thumb slowly tracing the edge of her ring finger. It was the only movement she allowed. Across from her, a man in his early 40s, business casual, silver laptop open, kept stealing glances her way. At first it was curiosity, then it turned into caution. There was something about the woman in 3A he hadn't noticed before. A weight, a presence, and she hadn't even spoken. At the front of the cabin, Chloe was unraveling. She wasn't stomping. She wasn't snapping at passengers or throwing trays. She was doing what scared flight attendants do when they're trying not to look scared. She smiled too hard. She moved too fast. She adjusted the same safety card twice, and the passengers noticed. One woman leaned toward her husband. "Is something going on?" she whispered. He shrugged. "No clue. But did you see the captain come out earlier?" Another row back. A teenage boy pulled off his headphones and looked toward the front. He could feel it, too. Something wasn't right. Monica, moving with the calm of someone who'd been through dozens of mid-air situations, tried to hold the rhythm together. She offered snacks, refilled waters, smiled politely, but she didn't try to smooth over the tension. Some things weren't hers to fix. Chloe brushed past her again, this time nearly knocking a tray off the counter. Monica caught it mid-fall without a word, but her eyes followed Chloe for a moment longer than usual. Something in the girl's face said she knew the floor was about to give out. "I've never seen first class this quiet." The businessman finally spoke, not to anyone in particular, muttering to the woman beside him. She nodded slowly. "Feels like something's coming." Back in coach, things were calmer, but not immune. A flight attendant whispered something to a colleague near the galley. A mother checking her toddler's seatbelt paused when she noticed both flight attendants looking toward the front, not the back. Everyone was looking forward. Everyone was sensing the shift. Even the flight deck could feel it. Captain Holt sat with his hands loosely resting on the yoke, not because he needed to fly manually, but because he was wired tight. Every couple of minutes, his eyes flicked to the cabin monitor. He hadn't received another message since the first alert, but that wasn't comforting. It was worse. It meant they were being observed, but not spoken to. Someone was watching, measuring, waiting. He tapped the intercom button and leaned in. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our initial descent into Chicago shortly. Please remain seated and buckle up when the seatbelt sign comes on." His voice was calm, level, but everyone heard the slight drag between the words. Chloe heard it, too. She stood near the curtain separating first class from the galley, her hands clenched too tightly around the drink cart's edge. She hadn't spoken to Barbara since the moment she'd tried to double-check her boarding pass. And now she didn't dare, because something was happening. Something bigger than a bad interaction or a customer complaint. She could feel it creeping in around the edges. like cold water seeping through a cracked window. She didn't know what Barbara had done, but she knew it had started. Passengers shifted in their seats, instinctively gathering things early, eyes flicking toward the aisle every time someone passed. A murmur of small talk grew and died again. No one wanted to admit they were nervous, but the tension buzzed in the air like static before a lightning strike. Barbara remained still. It wasn't patience, it was certainty. She didn't check her phone. She didn't lean toward the window. She didn't ask when they'd land because she already knew what came next and when the call would come. Inside the sleek, glass-paneled executive office of Horizon Regional Air's headquarters in Chicago, Charles Denning, the company's chief operations officer, was about to bite into his overpriced turkey wrap when his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Sir, there's a flagged alert. Passenger, red protocol, Langford tag." He didn't move. "Barbara Langford?" he asked calmly, though his fingers froze midair. "Yeah, sir. Flight 5182 midair right now." He set the sandwich down neatly. "Put it on screen." 2 seconds later, the alert file appeared on the wall display. The words weren't long. The message wasn't detailed, but the weight of the name made details irrelevant. "Jesus Christ," Charles muttered under his breath. He tapped a single key on his laptop, triggering a level 3 discretionary response. It wasn't a full-blown emergency, but it wasn't routine either. It meant one thing. We've got someone powerful on board, and we just made a mistake. Beside him, his chief risk officer, Marcy Lowe, appeared in the doorway. "Is it true Langford's on 5182? She whistled. "We're doing damage control." "No," Charles said, already dialing a secure number. "We're doing reputation rescue." Miles away, in a quiet corner of Manhattan, Cynthia Reyes was sitting at a mahogany conference table when her personal cell lit up. One word on the screen, "Barbara." She didn't answer right away. Cynthia didn't rush for anyone but for Barbara Langford. She picked up after one ring. Barbara's voice was soft, measured. "I'm midair. Flight 5182. Cynthia sat up straighter. "There's been an incident." Barbara didn't raise her voice. She didn't offer dramatic details, just a few sparse lines about a flight attendant who doubted, who dismissed, who doubled down even after being shown the truth. And that was enough. Cynthia didn't ask questions. She just said one thing: "I'll take care of it." Do you recognize that pivotal moment when everything changes? When a quiet action sets unstoppable forces in motion? At 11:46 a.m., a senior VP at Horizon Air received a personal message from Cynthia Reyes. 2 minutes later, an emergency operations meeting was called, not scheduled. Called. 10 executives dialed in. No one joked. No one asked to reschedule. The Langford name didn't allow for casual follow-ups. "I want eyes on the crew," Cynthia said. "I want to know their records, their complaints, and their contracts. I want to know who they are before this plane even hits the ground." The HR director on the call went pale. "You think it's that serious?" "Barbara doesn't call to chat," Cynthia replied flatly. "If she spoke up, we already screwed up. Our job now is to ensure the fallout doesn't reach the media or the board." Someone else on the call asked the dreaded question, "What if it does? It's ridiculous. No one answered, but everyone knew what it would mean. Stockholder meetings, forced resignations, PR nightmares with racial bias at 30,000 feet, plastered across headlines. The quiet ones always carried the most powerful consequences. Back on flight 5182, the seatbelt sign chimed on. Passengers slowly shifted. Tray tables clicked shut, but no one really relaxed. They still felt it. The tension, the stillness that had settled like fog in first class. Barbara Langford didn't move. She simply lifted her eyes toward the aisle as Chloe passed by. Not accusatory, not cruel, just steady. And somehow that look rattled Chloe more than if Barbara had yelled. She ducked into the galley, breathing fast, trying to steady her hands. Monica looked at her, concern etched deep in her face. "What happened, Doree?" "She's not just a passenger," Chloe whispered. How big do you whenever we're sibling? Chloe swallowed hard. Like owns a piece of the airline, big. Monica didn't speak for a long time. When she did, it was slow, quiet. Then you better hope that call she made wasn't the kind that ends careers. In Chicago's corporate tower, executives were scrambling. Not because Barbara demanded it, but because she didn't. Silence was worse than outrage. A quiet woman with quiet power meant you didn't know what she would do next. They began preparing internal documents, investigations, preemptive press statements, but most of all, they started preparing for in-flight crew reassignment, the kind of action reserved for major emergencies, the kind of action that had never been done on a flight like this before. Because Barbara hadn't asked for anyone to be fired. She'd simply placed a call, and now the machine was moving to fix itself because if they didn't act first, she would. In the cockpit, Captain Holtz received a final ping. Prepare for post-landing crew removal. Names to follow. No public announcement. Maintain discretion. He stared at the message for a long second, then sighed. This is going to be messy. His co-pilot glanced over. What's going on? He didn't answer. Some truths didn't belong in the air. In row 3A, Barbara folded her hands again. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. But somewhere inside, she knew the dominoes had started falling. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to remind the world what happened when people forgot who they were speaking to. As the landing gear dropped and the familiar screech of hydraulics filled the cabin, passengers stirred, but only slightly. There was no chatter, no jokes about turbulence, no scrambling for overhead bins, just silence. Not a peaceful kind, but a tight silence like everyone could feel something sharp about to snap. Barbara Langford sat upright in her seat, eyes calm, her expression unreadable. She didn't check her phone, didn't speak. Her presence alone made the people around her sit straighter without even realizing why. Chloe stood at the front of the cabin, her fingers gripping the side handles so tightly her knuckles went white. The seat belt light turned off with a chime, but still no one stood because that's when the intercom buzzed. The captain's voice came through, calm, precise. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a brief moment. There will be a crew transition before deplaning begins. We appreciate your cooperation. A crew transition. The businessman in 2A frowned. What does that mean? The elderly couple in 4C and 4D glanced at each other. The teenager across the aisle slowly pulled off his headphones again. Even Monica, who had flown through medical emergencies, celebrity tantrums, and FAA inspections, stiffened slightly. She turned toward Chloe, who looked like she was about to be sick. Chloe, she whispered, what did you do? Before Chloe could respond, the front door of the aircraft opened and two uniformed airline supervisors stepped in. Not TSA, not security, internal corporate staff. Their blazers were sharper, their expressions unreadable. They moved with purpose. A murmur passed through the cabin like a ripple across still water. Barbara Langford still hadn't moved. The lead supervisor, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, stepped forward and spoke just loud enough for the front cabin to hear. Flight attendant Chloe Hartley, please step forward. It wasn't barked. It wasn't angry. That made it worse. Chloe blinked once, twice. Her legs moved before her brain caught up. She took 3 slow steps forward, cheeks burning, feeling every eye in the cabin press into her skin. Monica's lips parted. She reached out, maybe to stop her, maybe to speak, but stopped herself. The supervisor didn't ask for an explanation, didn't offer one either. He simply handed Chloe a sealed envelope. Inside, a letter with one sentence bolded in red. You are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately, pending formal review. Chloe didn't cry, not yet, but her throat burned. The supervisor turned to Monica. You'll complete the final cabin walkthrough, then you're free to deplane. Monica gave a single nod. Passengers watched in frozen silence as Chloe gathered her things, her hands trembling. She didn't speak, didn't make a scene. She simply walked down the aisle toward the galley past every passenger who had watched the entire thing happen in real time. Some turned away, others didn't. She passed 3A. Barbara didn't look at her. That somehow stung more than if she had. Chloe stepped off the plane without a sound. Only then did Barbara rise. Monica was still standing at the front trying to collect herself when the second supervisor turned to her. "There's one more item," he said. He handed her a small card. On it, the logo of Langford Holdings and a handwritten note. It read, "Kindness does not require uniform, but arrogance makes the best uniform look cheap." Monica stared at it for a long second. When she looked up, Barbara was already moving down the aisle. And this time, every passenger stepped aside to let her pass. Not because she demanded it, but because they wanted to. As she neared the door, the captain stepped out of the cockpit. "Mrs. Langford," he said, his voice steady but deeply respectful. "Thank you for flying with us today." Barbara gave him a small nod. Her words were soft. "Let's make sure no one forgets how today felt." Then she stepped off the aircraft. Think about it. How often do we let people's appearances dictate how we treat them? What might we miss when we jump to assumptions? By the time Barbara Langford stepped off Flight 5182 and into the terminal, the story was already moving quietly like smoke before a fire. She didn't need to speak to a single reporter. She didn't need to post a single word. The silence she had carried through that cabin had spoken for her, and people were already listening. 2 terminals over, an off-duty flight attendant named Marcus Doyle had just finished his shift and was sipping bad coffee near Gate 12 when he got the first text. "Yo, Chloe Hartley just got pulled off 5182 mid-cabin. While passengers were still on board," he blinked. Langford was on that flight. Barbara Langford. Marcus' coffee froze halfway to his lips. "You serious?" "Swear to God." Supervisor walked her off. Whole plane saw it. Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced across the terminal at the company info screen. No alerts, no bulletins. But he knew how this worked. If it was true, the damage was already done. Not because it had leaked, but because the people who mattered most had seen it unfold in real time. Meanwhile, in the back end of the airline's internal Slack channels, conversations were exploding under the surface. Threads labeled "Private Crew Null" and "HR Tagged" lit up with quiet fury. One user dropped a message that summed it up perfectly. "If Barbara Langford gets mistreated, and it takes this much to fix it, what happens to people who aren't Barbara Langford?" Good shot, That message got 47 reactions in under 2 minutes. Even more telling, 3 of them were from HR managers. Outside the airport, Barbara moved calmly through the terminal. No assistants, no entourage, just her soft white coat and the quiet rhythm of her heels on tile. As she passed a row of digital advertising screens, her phone buzzed. One of her executive assistants had forwarded a tweet. "Rumors of VIP quietly pulled half a crew off a flight in Chicago this morning. No yelling, no headlines, just gone." It had less than 200 likes. But Barbara knew better than anyone. The internet didn't shout at first. It watched. And when it came time to strike, it struck hard. She stepped into the backseat of her waiting car and gave the driver a small nod. No need for words. The car pulled into traffic, inside Horizon Air's corporate HQ. The mood had shifted. Earlier that morning, executives had scrambled to get ahead of what they thought was a manageable incident. But by late afternoon, it was clear this wasn't about one flight or one mistake. It was about perception, and the perception was a woman with quiet power had walked onto their plane, been mistreated by someone who didn't recognize her, and instead of retaliating with a press conference or a lawsuit, she had made a single phone call and turned the entire flight inside out. And people loved that. They loved that she didn't scream. They loved that she didn't tweet. She just acted. Now headlines were beginning to creep in. Small ones on industry blogs. "Flight crew replaced mid-flight on Horizon 5182. Source says executive passenger prompted action." An aviation analyst posted a breakdown on LinkedIn. "Rare crew transition during deboarding is almost unheard of. suggests internal escalation at the highest level. Horizon has explaining to do in the communications department. A junior PR analyst nervously approached her manager. Do we have a response plan? The manager rubbed her temples. No, not yet. Shouldn't we issue a statement? We don't even know what we'd be denying. Because that was the worst part. Barbara hadn't said anything. And that silence terrified them more than any lawsuit. On a quiet bench outside the terminal, Chloe sat with her duffel bag at her feet, scrolling through her phone with numb fingers. She had no messages and no calls. No idea what came next. Her hands still trembled. A group of passengers from her flight walked by me. One woman paused, looked at her, then turned away sharply, whispering something to the person next to her. Chloe didn't blame her. She didn't blame any of them. She blamed herself. She had made a mistake. A big one. She had judged too fast, spoken too harshly, doubled down instead of stepping back. And now she was sitting outside an airport terminal with no uniform and no title, waiting to find out if she still had a job. Somewhere behind her, a plane took off. The roar echoed deep in her chest. Back in the executive conference room, Charles Denning stood at the window overlooking the tarmac. Marcy Lowe joined him. We're still not making a statement. No, Charles said. She doesn't need to. Marcy glanced at her phone. We're trending, not by name, but by incident. Flight 51182. Get ahead of it. How? He didn't answer. Because there wasn't a good way to spin this. No statement could rewrite what passengers had seen with their own eyes. A respected older woman treated like she didn't belong, only to reveal through silence, not shouting, that she belonged more than anyone else in that cabin. She didn't just own stock. She owned the room. And now she owned the narrative. Late that night, Barbara sat in her living room. Lights dimmed, a classical vinyl humming softly in the background. Her phone buzzed. A text from Cynthia Reyes. Perfect execution, no blood, all the damage where it hurts most. Barbara smiled softly. Typed 2 words, not done. Then she set the phone down and closed her eyes because the real message hadn't been delivered yet, and the final move was still to come. Have you ever witnessed the aftermath of someone underestimating a person they should have respected? What happened when the truth came to light? By the time the Horizon Airlines executive board gathered inside the 21st floor conference room at their Chicago headquarters, every person at the table had already heard the same story, just told a dozen different ways. Some heard it from an internal memo, some from Slack, others from their teenage kids who had seen the Flight 5182 hashtag starting to trend that morning on TikTok. But the facts were unavoidable now. A high-ranking, well-respected passenger had been publicly humiliated by a flight attendant. A portion of the cabin crew had been relieved on the tarmac before passengers even stood up to retrieve their bags. And no one, not PR, not legal, not operations, had a clue it was coming because the woman behind it never raised her voice. She didn't threaten. She didn't plead. She made one phone call, and everything started shifting. At the head of the table sat CEO Martin Voss. He was sharp-suited with gray at his temples and a permanent crease in his brow that suggested he slept less than anyone else in the room. To his right sat Marcy Lowe, VP of Communications, already scrolling on a muted iPad. Her feed showed comment after comment. Anyone know who was on Flight 5182 today? Something huge went down. You could feel the tension in the air. Respect isn't optional anymore. Good. On his left, General Counsel Richard Evans was tapping a thick file on the tabletop with controlled frustration. She hasn't filed anything formal, no complaint, no demand, not even a statement. Which makes it worse, Marcy muttered. Because it means we have zero control. Martin Voss leaned back. Where's the update on her identity? A silence. Then Richard spoke. We confirmed this morning. The passenger in 3E was Barbara Langford. The name dropped like a bomb in the room. Half the table froze. The other half turned to look at one another. The chairwoman of Langford Holding, multi-sector investor across energy, biotech, and aviation, and most importantly, a 9.7% stakeholder in Horizon Group Holdings, the very company that owned Horizon Airlines. She didn't just fly the plane, she had the power to ground it. Martin Voss pinched the bridge of his nose. Tell me this wasn't the first time we've had complaints about that crew. Richard didn't speak. He didn't need to. A young director in HR, Maria Cortez, flipped open her laptop and projected a list to the boardroom screen. Names, dates, incidents. Chloe Hartley's name appeared next to 4 flagged reports, ranging from tone violations to a past instance of removing a black veteran from business class over a ticket mismatch that turned out to be an error on the airline's end. The boardroom filled with a quiet, burning tension. Martin's voice dropped to a razor's edge. Why was she still flying first-class routes? Maria didn't have an answer. No one did. Down the hall, the IT team quietly watched as Barbara Langford's name continued to spread. Not on gossip sites, but among executive forums and boardroom whisper networks. She hadn't spoken, but her silence had grown teeth. Across LinkedIn, an anonymous post with titles like The Power of a Quiet Call and What Flight 412 Taught Me About Boardroom Power gained traction. Someone even published a timeline of the incident. Passengers had clearly started sharing details. The buzzword of the day wasn't lawsuit, it was governance. Back in the conference room, Martin Voss stood. This goes deeper than PR. This is about culture. This is about every unspoken assumption built into our structure. He pointed toward the HR screen. You see that list? That's not a Chloe Hartley problem. That's a leadership rot problem. Someone let that attitude fester. He turned to Marcy. You said there's no statement from Langford. Not yet. Then we're not waiting. He grabbed a marker and began writing on the glass wall behind him. 1. Suspend Chloe Hartley indefinitely. 2. Launch third-party investigation of internal bias complaints. 3. Send formal letter of apology, not from PR, from me. He underlined the last point 3 times. I want that letter delivered to her doorstep tonight. Hand-delivered, not emailed, not faxed. Richard raised a brow. You sure that's not too deferential? Martin's jaw tightened. She owns nearly 10% of this company. Richard, you think she wants an apology? No, she wants integrity. And right now, we don't have any. As the meeting continued, calls were made. A law firm specializing in corporate equity audits was retained before lunch. A DEI consulting group was scheduled to arrive on site by Thursday, and by sunset, every internal portal featured a message from Martin Voss himself. Respect is not a policy. It's our foundation. That foundation was shaken this week. We will rebuild it starting now. It was short, intentional, and very much not approved by legal, which is why it resonated. That night, Barbara Langford stood on the balcony of her townhouse looking out over the river. Her assistant Clara approached with a sealed envelope. From Martin Voss, she said, delivered by hand. Barbara opened it slowly and read a short letter, hand-signed with no fluff. Miss Langford, what happened aboard Flight 5182 never should have happened. Not because of who you are, but because it should never happen to anyone. We failed, and I take full responsibility. Horizon is launching an independent review of all customer-facing operations effective immediately. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, only the chance to do better with accountability. Martin Voss. Barbara read it twice, then folded it neatly and smiled. Barbara Langford woke just before dawn, the pale Chicago light filtering through linen curtains into her study. The house was quiet, apart from a small crackle from the wood stove in the corner and the distant wail of a lone train crossing the valley floor. She poured a cup of strong black coffee and settled into her high-backed leather chair with her laptop open on the small oak desk. Yesterday's events had unfolded faster than any corporate drama she'd ever encountered, and she felt no rush to explain or justify her actions. She never did. She simply did what needed doing. A boardroom crack swept through Horizon's echo chambers had been enough to correct itself. To pull the flight crew off the plane had been enough to correct an immediate wrong. But as the sun rose, flooding the room with gentle light, Barbara knew that the deeper fissures still ran through Horizon Airlines itself. One flight attendant's dismissal and a scramble of executives could soothe the immediate sting, but it wouldn't address the systemic arrogance and bias baked into a culture that allowed a 68-year-old widow in a worn coat to be shouted at, shoved aside, and nearly ignored. She took another sip of coffee and opened a secure chat window to her most trusted financial advisor, Daniel Morse. He was the same veteran banker who'd helped her husband navigate the fallout of a near bankruptcy decades ago and who'd remained her confidant through every boardroom battle since. The chat on her screen read, "Daniel, please prepare the communications. I'm going to place the second call now. What's the directive? Langford freeze trading on Horizon Airlines NYC, Clause 7.2B full audit, notify through Solera Capital. Correct. Roger that. Executing in 3, 2, 1. Barbara inhaled deeply, rested her hand on the phone's touchscreen, and dialed the secure line for Lydia Hartman, CEO of Solera Capital and heir to the Langford legacy. It rang only twice before Lydia picked up, her voice crisp but filled with warmth. "Mother," Lydia said softly. "Lydia," Barbara replied evenly. "It's time." There was a pause. Then Lydia's tone sharpened to business. "Clause 7.2. Got it. Engaging automatic freeze. I'll handle the rest." Barbara closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar steadiness wash over her. The coffee's warmth seeped into her chest as she listened to the soft click of digital transmissions, behind-the-line alerts to Solera's trading desk, internal memos to the compliance team, instructions to counsel. All shares held by Solera will be locked until we see a thorough internal review report. Lydia continued, "I'll copy you on the press release draft. I'll let them know it's at your request. We'll quote your words." Barbara nodded, though Lydia couldn't see it. "Thank you, dear." And she paused, leaning back in her chair. "Include a call for industry-wide standards on crew conduct and customer dignity. Consider it done," Lydia said. Barbara ended the call and sat quietly, letting the early morning hush settle around her study. She took another slow sip of coffee. Outside, a red-tailed hawk soared above the treetops. The world felt at once infinitely large and precisely attuned to this one small Chicago townhouse. 2 hours later, the New York Stock Exchange trading floor buzzed with unusual energy. At 9 a.m. sharp, Horizon Airlines, ticker HZN, opened to a flurry of sell orders, only to stall instantly. Traders peered at their screens, their eyebrows knitting as they saw the dreaded red banner. Trading halted, pending regulatory disclosure for Solera Capital Holdings. Phones began ringing. Newswires lit up with the alert. Solera Capital, 9.7% shareholder, has requested a trading freeze on Horizon Airlines stock pending full audit of internal policies after reported discrimination incident. The trading floor erupted in hushed excitement. Speculators buzzed that Solera Capital rarely used its shareholder power so overtly. Financial analysts on the pit floors whispered about possible credit downgrades, bond yields spiking, short interest rising. At the same time, screen tickers flashed a breaking news crawl. Senior investor Langford halts airline shares. Corporate governance under scrutiny. The story was front-page news within minutes. Bloomberg terminals dinged. CNBC preempted scheduled programming. A banner across Fox Business declared Langford legacy shareholder revolt or justified accountability. Inside the pit, a young trader named Raj Patel pounded the desk. "I'm telling you, this is huge," he said to his colleague. "If a silent call from a VIP passenger can freeze the stock of a major airline, what happens to us little guys? We're toast." His colleague shrugged. "It's classic power play. But this was no threat. This was principle. Everyone's watching now, brother," thought Raj. "And I'm losing my lunch money." Back at Horizon Airlines headquarters in Chicago, Martin Voss stared at his phone screen in disbelief. He tapped his thumb against the glossy black glass, his mind racing. Trading freeze, full audit, industry standards. This was beyond any PR crisis he'd ever managed. He marched down the hall to the emergency meeting room already filled with executives, legal counsel, IR teams, and outside consultants. Marcy Lowe, VP of Communications, looked pale but determined. She was scrolling through live media coverage on a video wall. The headlines were merciless. Passenger power, how one phone call. Grounded in airline. Can customer dignity drive corporate governance? Flight 5182 and the widow who won't be ignored. She didn't look up as Martin entered. Instead, she gestured for the team's attention. We have a trading halt in effect, she said. Solera Capital's call is public. They've put the narrative on our hands, our reputation, our stock price, our future. One of the outside consultants, a graying corporate governance expert named Dr. Elise Nakamura, raised a hand. I've advised on board-level investigations, she said quietly, but I've never seen a freeze triggered so fast, especially by a non-board member. It speaks volumes about perceived accountability failures within the company. Richard Evans, the general counsel, interjected. We have to cooperate fully. The audit scope must satisfy Solera's demands. Ideally, broaden it to show we're proactive, not reactive. Martin nodded. I want a full review of crew training, HR policies, bias reporting channels, everything. But we need a public commitment by lunchtime. We cannot squander this moment. Marcy chimed in. We'll craft a statement from you. It will read, Horizon Airlines recognizes the seriousness of Ms. Langford's concerns. We are commissioning an independent review into all aspects of our customer service protocols and crew conduct standards. We commit to full transparency and swift remedial action. Martin tapped the table. Yes, and we'll schedule a shareholder video call tomorrow. I want Miss Langford there if she's willing to speak. We owe her that platform. Richard looked uneasy. That's risky. If she takes the stage, this will be all the headline. People will watch her, not us. Martin drew a breath. Let them watch her. Let them see what leadership looks like. How often do we witness true leadership, the kind that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but with quiet, purposeful action? Meanwhile, at Solera Capital's Manhattan offices, Lydia Hartman oversaw her own war room. Analysts were pulling data on Horizon's financials. Risk managers were calculating potential credit downgrades. PR staff drafted social media posts celebrating stakeholder activism and corporate social responsibility. Lydia's inbox pinged. Chairwoman Langford holds court at board call preview. Shareholders are lining up questions. She smiled. Arrange for her to dial in, she told her assistant, and make sure the line is clear. No interruptions. She paused, tapping her pen against her desk. Get me the list of top 10 questions, especially on bias protocol, and send me one question from the audience. What responsibility do investors have to protect customer dignity? Make sure Barbara sees it. Because Barbara Langford wasn't just making calls, she was shaping the tone of an entire industry conversation. That afternoon, Robin Banks, a reporter for a major business news site, called Martin Voss and secured the first exclusive quote. We welcome Solera Capital's leadership on this matter. Accountability and respect are at the core of our business. We will emerge stronger with renewed trust from our customers. The headline hit digital news feeds at exactly 2:17 p.m. Horizon to launch independent audit after VIP passenger second call freezes stock. Within minutes, the company's PR phone lines were inundated. Customers called to cancel flights, some in anger, some in solidarity. Travel agents texted airline liaisons asking for reassurances. Even the check-in counters felt tension as agents awkwardly explained delays to travelers heading out of Chicago. In the break room, a young reservation agent named Kyle gathered his coworkers. Did you see the news? He asked. Like, the big boss told us to say we're undergoing a proactive review. What does that even mean? A veteran agent, Ellen, sighed. It means we're screwed until they sort this out. But if we do it right, maybe people will come back to us. They exchanged nervous looks, then put on their smiles and returned to the line of passengers checking in. As twilight descended over Chicago, Barbara Langford closed her laptop and rose from her chair. There was nothing more she needed to do tonight. The market was frozen. The company was scrambling. The board was mobilized. Headlines had her name and her cause emblazoned across screens worldwide. She stepped onto her balcony, inhaling the crisp evening air. Across the hills, lights winked on as darkness settled in. She pictured the trading floor, dark now in their freeze. She pictured the boardroom, frenetic with calls and memos. She pictured Chloe, wherever she was, wondering how things had spiraled so far from a single flight attendant's outburst. Barbara's hand went to the locket she wore at her throat, a small oval containing a miniature portrait of her late husband in his Air Force uniform. She touched the cool metal and whispered, "Thank you," not for what she'd done, but for the lesson she learned long ago. Respect is not given, it's held in quiet power, ready to be wielded when needed. And when the world heard the echo of her second call, it didn't roar, it rippled, because sometimes the loudest voices are the ones that don't speak at all. What quiet power do you hold? How might you use it not just for yourself, but to change systems that need changing?